Hi, my name is Kristen Schmidt, and I'll be reviewing the Americans with Disabilities Act. I'm sorry I can't be there in class today, but hopefully this will be beneficial to everyone. So just a little bit of background. The act was passed in 1990, and it applies to employers with over 15 employees. So basically most companies, aside from the very, very small employers. And it's divided into 3 sections. So there's Title I, Title II, and Title III, which we'll review today. So Title I states that employment discrimination is prohibited against individuals with disabilities who are able to perform the essential functions of the job with or without reasonable accommodation. So you can see that I highlighted here, basically like the book did, individuals with disabilities, essential functions of the job, and reasonable accommodation, because those are really the 3 critical elements of this act that are important to differentiate so that we can understand exactly what it's saying. And we'll go through each one of them. So individuals with disabilities are basically anyone who has a limitation in the functions listed below. So hopefully you can see all of them, but I listed walking, somebody who has a limitation in walking, bathing, breathing, dressing, toileting, transferring, continence, eating, sitting, lifting, seeing, hearing, many, many things. This is considered a disability. There are also medical conditions that people can have that make them disabled. So things like alcoholism and drug addiction, if the person is in active treatment or rehabilitation recovery, that's considered a disability. If they're an alcoholic and they're not in treatment, that's not a disability. So there are some fine differentiations with things. It's similar with reading. If somebody has dyslexia, that's a disability. If somebody didn't graduate high school and therefore they can't read, well, that's not a disability. That's just, a limitation that they have because they didn't get the proper training or education. Other medical conditions, getting back to this, include things like epilepsy, HIV, diabetes, cerebral palsy, other illnesses like that. So those are your disabilities. Other areas to consider. So it's illegal for an employer to perceive that someone is unable to do something due to their perception of a disability or an illness. So the example that the book gives is somebody suffers a heart attack and they're cleared to come back to work, and the employer is concerned that it's just going to be too stressful for them, that it's going to affect their health, and they say, no, don't come back. That is illegal according to the Americans with Disabilities Act, because you can't act based on a perception. Another thing is that the American with Disabilities Act was expanded in 2008 to cover more than just this list of disabilities that we went through. It also now covers communicating and things like immune system dysfunction, digestive dysfunction, amongst some other items. So essential functions, if we go back to the definition that we have here, we talked about employment discrimination against people with disabilities who are able to perform essential functions of the job. So what exactly does that mean? So job duties are divided into 2 categories. There are essential functions, which kind of intuitively are the functions that are required to work, to be effective. And then there are marginal functions. So those are functions that are not critical to job performance. So really, not anybody can do them, but some employees can do them. But all employees don't have to do them to be productive at their job. Employers can ask questions to candidates whether they're qualified to perform essential functions, but they can't specifically ask about their disability. And reasonable accommodation. Again, going back to our definition, employment discrimination is prohibited against people with disabilities who can perform essential functions of the job either with or without reasonable accommodation. So either they don't need any accommodation and they can just perform the functions, or they do need a reasonable accommodation. So what is a reasonable accommodation? Typically this is something that's requested by the employee. And really it's considered reasonable based on the resources of the company. So if you have you know, a very small company, they have more limited resources perhaps than a company like, you know, IBM, who potentially could do more for their employees in terms of what they can and can't accommodate. And often these accommodations are not costly. So it can be something like adding a wheelchair ramp so that somebody who's wheelchair bound can get into the building, or lowering countertops so that somebody can reach things if they have that sort of disability. Installing things to the telephone so that somebody who's hard of hearing or deaf can be able to communicate. If the company is not able to do those things, it's possible that the disabled employee can provide those things. So that's a provision within the Act as well. But again, these things are often not costly. It's really reasonable depending on what the company can manage based on their size. So what's a failure to make a reasonable accommodation? This is an instance where a reasonable accommodation was requested, but it was denied. So again, it's reasonable. It's something that the company realistically can do. And the reasonable accommodation needs to exist. So it can't be sort of something in the abstract. It has to be something like, you know, I was talking about the telephone, some technology that actually would be able to help somebody who's hard of hearing interpret, you know, and understand on the telephone. And the person needs to be otherwise qualified to do the job. So if they have this reasonable accommodation, they're able to do the job. They're completely qualified. If they don't meet these things, that would be a failure to make a reasonable accommodation for an employee. So Titles 2 and Title 3, basically the book just said that these apply more to state and local governments and also to areas of public accommodation. So places like hotels and what sort of guidelines they need to meet in terms of, you know, people with disabilities. Unfortunately, I can't take questions because obviously I'm not there with you today. But hopefully, I think maybe there was another person that was assigned this, and if there are questions, the class can discuss. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to seeing everyone in class next time. Thank you.